Hey, it's Virus Wars, guy. So, you're probably wondering what is up with the thumbnail. Am I seriously suggesting that smallpox actually came from America? Have I descended so far down the rabbit hole of insane conspiracy theories that even the flat earthers aren't returning my calls? Yes, no, maybe. Hear me out. Okay, this video is going to be a bit different. Normally, I pick a disease and talk science, and that had been my plan for smallpox, but part of what I wanted to discuss was its historical context, both because it was instrumental to the development of vaccination as a concept, and because it's the only human disease we have been able to eradicate. But the more I dug into that background, the more I realized that there is a massive mystery in the historical record. A mystery about what smallpox is and isn't and how it came to be. I want to talk about this mystery, but that means stepping a bit outside my comfort zone of science and shitposting. Today, we are going to do some history. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Virus Wars. But first, a few science facts to help out this historical context. What is smallpox as we know it today? 1. Smallpox is an infectious disease caused by the variola virus. 2. Smallpox makes you severely ill and causes pustules to erupt in your mouth and on your skin. 3. Smallpox has about a 30% chance of killing you. Or does it? Let's put a pin in that. 4. Once you get smallpox, you're immune, and you never get it again, provided you survive. And 5. Because of this, smallpox was historically known primarily as a disease of children, and an epidemic-style disease, which is where it sweeps into a region, infects a large portion of the non-immune population, then burns out and fades for a few years, until there is a sufficient number of non-immune people for another epidemic to happen. So the history. Smallpox first emerged in an unspecified location, but maybe the Horn of Africa or the Fertile Crescent about 4,000 years ago, or maybe about 3,500 years ago in China, or Egypt, or India, or it emerged 500 years ago in late Renaissance, early modern Europe. Maybe. It caused the Antonine Plague of 165 AD, or maybe that was measles, or chickenpox, or just the plague. It wiped out a third of Japan's population in the 700s, except maybe that also wasn't smallpox. See, it's weird. It gets weirder. Let's put a pin in that too. So, I am going to try to be a little less schizophrenic and sum up the hard evidence. The oldest isolates of DNA from the variola virus date to roughly 600 to 900 AD, with genomic comparison and math suggesting that the variola virus probably emerged as a human pathogen around 300 AD, give or take a few hundred years. The 4,000 years ago figure is based on older studies with weaker evidence, and while we will revisit this figure later, for now we'll say that the science points to the 300 AD date as more believable. If you look at the historical record, you will absolutely find plenty of descriptions of weird but temporary pockmarked skin disease dating back well before this time, both from the Greeks and the Chinese. However, the best surviving early description of smallpox comes from the Persian physician Abu Bakr al-Razi around 900 AD, who not only described it, but, and this is important, clinically and physiologically differentiated it from measles and chickenpox. So here we have a reliable source for smallpox, distinguished from similar potential diseases. But remember I said it gets weird? Here's the thing. The concept of infectious disease was unknown at the time, and al-Razi described smallpox as a symptom of the natural maturation of the blood. To clarify this a little for modern times, al-Razi's take on smallpox was basically that it was a normal part of puberty to everyone that gets it, and that also it's nothing to worry about. And this isn't a solitary bad take. He wasn't alone in this. Smallpox spread to Europe over the next few hundred years, maybe, probably thanks to the Crusades, although some evidence suggests it was there earlier. But critically, this happened without any of the alarm or fanfare we might expect to accompany a disease that kills a third of its victims. In 1546, the Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro wrote about smallpox and said the following: "Almost all of us suffer from this malady, since we all carry with us that menstrual infection from our mother's womb. Hence, this fever is of itself seldom fatal." Again, the causative explanation is incredibly dubious, but the overall message is like, yeah, we all get it as kids. It's not a big deal. I mean, not like it kills anyone, right? Jumping back in time and a bit over geographically to Asia, circa 400 AD, you can see that Chinese and Indian records do take the disease more seriously. I struggle to find any primary sources here, but in terms of severity, the smallpox endemic to Asia was nowhere near 30% lethal, but was considered dangerous enough to not be quote-unquote normal, and to require special measures to protect and treat yourself. Just as an amusing aside, I read about a regional medieval Chinese superstition that posited that there was a goddess who was incredibly beautiful, but also incredibly jealous of her beauty. So if she thought you were too beautiful, she would hit you with the ugly stick. That stick being smallpox. And now for the elephant in the room, Japan, circa 735 AD. A mysterious plague sweeps through the islands, killing a third of its human population. This disease continued to be reported in Japan through 1200, causing spontaneous epidemics, much like smallpox might do. The description of the symptoms of the disease are consistent with smallpox, although the pathogen itself has never been isolated from any historical samples via modern methods. But whatever it was that swept through Japan, and it does sound an awful lot like smallpox, was far deadlier than what continental Asia or the Middle East was reporting around the same time. Regardless, prior to the 16th century, this is the only reasonably reliable historical example of smallpox causing the severe disease that we associate with it today. It's a massive outlier in a world where smallpox was considered to be anything from moderately dangerous to borderline harmless. So let's put a pin in this too, and jump forward in time. Yay! The year is 1523, and Toribio Motolinia, missionary of the Franciscan order, arrives in the newly conquered Spanish territories in present-day Mexico, and witnesses the impact that European diseases have had on the native population. Among these, smallpox stands out in its lethality. It's estimated that between 1520 and 1600, close to 90% of Mexico's native population succumbed to some combination of diseases and the social collapse that followed. And while it's difficult to attribute a specific number to smallpox in particular, Motolinia describes a smallpox that we're more familiar with today. That is, a disease that kills about 25 to 35% of the people that it infects. If you've been paying attention, remember, around the same time, physician Girolamo Fracastoro of Italy was describing smallpox as a harmless disease. And I hope you're now starting to see what I'm trying to get at, which is the mystery of smallpox. Something happened around the year 1500, something that turned smallpox from a harmless pest to a stone-cold killer. What happened, and why, and how? That is the real mystery of smallpox. We can't say exactly where and exactly how, but around 1500, the harmless smallpox that humanity had known for 1,000 years or more changed into something more virulent and something far deadlier. The natives of Mexico were among its first victims, but this new smallpox did not spare the old world. Soon, Europe would start to see outbreaks of smallpox epidemics, ones consistent with the severity and clinical features of New World smallpox. The first recorded incident was arguably in Naples in 1544. After this followed a lull until the 1570s, when there were several severe, high-profile, and lethal epidemics of what was undeniably smallpox in Italy in quick succession. Whether it had been quietly spreading through the Old World for some time, or whether, in a twist of cosmic irony, it had been carried back from the New World by returning ships, over the next 100 years, this new smallpox became established as the dominant form of the disease, at first in Europe, then spreading outward to colonial territories. Far from being seen as a harmless adolescent disease, by 1800 it would be known as the Reaper of Children. I think we have almost all of the pieces of this puzzle, or at least as many as we can get reliably from documentation alone, but there is one more thing I wanted to bring up. Around 1900, a new strain of smallpox was discovered, or perhaps rediscovered. Let's put a pin in that. This strain caused largely ambulatory disease, which is doctor speak for not sick enough to be in the hospital. It didn't make people as severely ill, though it did cause the characteristic smallpox rash and subsequent scarring. And it had an estimated 1% mortality rate. It was named variola minor to distinguish it from what was now the conventional, extremely lethal smallpox, which would henceforth be called variola major. Variola minor strains were found all around the world, and it was assumed at the time, and by basically every academic since then, that variola minor emerged from variola major relatively recently, and possibly several times in different places, as a natural adaptation to humans. Because, generally speaking, obligate human viral pathogens trade off lethality for infectivity over time. But the more astute of you might be thinking, this sounds a lot like the smallpox Al-Razi and Fracastoro were describing in their time. And this is one of the most frustrating aspects of researching this topic, that pretty much every modern academic source on historical smallpox just largely assumes that the smallpox humanity has been dealing with all this time was variola major, the highly lethal smallpox. Then they all just cite each other, so fucking good luck figuring out your sources. So here I need to give credit to Arthur Silverstein, who actually pointed out the historical discrepancy in his book, A History of Immunology. He didn't go into it in detail, but he dove into the sources and basically wrote, that's weird. This was back in 1989, but 2 years prior, he wrote a paper with colleague Anne Carmichael that goes into the subject further. And that's about it. We've seen some shifts in perspective only within the last 10 years, and I will cover that. But let's lay out the facts as I see them. First, it's pretty clear that when we're talking about smallpox, we're not always talking about the same smallpox. Based on historical record alone, there are 4 separate poxes to take into consideration, maybe. First, we have a smallpox that devastated Mexico, then Europe, then the broader world starting in the 16th century. It's the most lethal smallpox we know of, and is almost definitively the ancestor of the strains of the smallpox virus that we call variola major today. Let's call it major pox for simplicity. Then we have the minimally lethal smallpox that was identified at the turn of the 20th century in several places in the world. This was the variola minor family of strains of smallpox virus, so let's call it minor pox. Third, we have the smallpox documented in the Middle East and Europe from at least the 10th to the 16th century, and it was also minimally lethal. I'm going to call this Razi pox, after Al-Razi. Starting with the 16th century, this smallpox all but disappeared. Or did it? Or did it? Ooh. Keep listening to learn the answer. I actually don't know exactly, but keep listening. All right, third, we have the smallpox documented in China and India from around the 4th to 5th century onward, with unknown lethality, but probably higher than Razi pox and lower than major pox. We'll call this oxypox. Oxy, like for Occidental, which is the fancy word for Eastern. Fifth, there is whatever the hell happened to Japan in 735 AD. There is unfortunately no viral isolate for this plague, but if it really was smallpox, that is a strain of the variola virus, then it was exceptionally unique for its time. We'll call this one Otapox. Lastly, there's a 3,000-year-old mummy that apparently had a skin disease at some point. People bring this up as evidence of smallpox being present in Egypt around 1500 BC, but there is no molecular evidence, so this is somewhat spurious. Now let's talk very briefly about some recent science, namely 4 different studies, because they can help fill out this perspective. A 2016 microbiological archaeology paper describes the isolation of a strain of major pox from a victim in what is present-day Lithuania circa 1650, and compares it with other more modern reference strains. This paper dates the origin of major pox to between 1530 and 1645. Now this is a little fuzzy, and you always have to give or take, 50 to several hundred years here, but this flies in the face of a conventional academic understanding of smallpox history, but also, crucially, lines up with the historical record. A 2020 microbiological archaeology paper describes the isolation of strains of the variola virus from mummies from Nordic cadavers circa 600 to 1000 AD. Now, this would put smallpox in Europe a few centuries earlier than we previously thought, and would make the smallpox at least a contemporary of Rossypox. Using the same sort of genetics-based dating techniques, this group dates the emergence of the variola virus as a human pathogen to 1700 years ago, or about the 3rd or 4th century, which makes the CDC smallpox history website a little obsolete, but also basically lines up with a historical record. A 2018 microbiological archaeology paper looked at variola major and minor, that is, major pox and minor pox in our little classification system, and dated the divergence of the two strains to about 500 years ago. About 500 years is also, according to the Lithuanian victim paper, when major pox first emerged. I should note, as a point of contrast, that an earlier study from 2010 put the emergence of variola at around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and the divergence of major pox and minor pox to about 1,000 years ago. This study is generally the one you see cited as authoritative, but it's working with less data and, at least in my opinion, looser assumptions, which can impact the math under the hood quite a lot. Most of the more recent studies have been throwing shade at it in the discussions and, in the very modern and very bland sort of way that contemporary scientists do. I just thought that was funny. Okay, so if we take all of this into account, can we reconstruct the timeline, the true history of smallpox, and solve our mystery? Well, no. No, that would require real and actual work that nobody has the funding for these days, and probably never will, considering smallpox is an eradicated disease. But we can at least come up with some theories, okay? So, here we go. Theory 1, the null hypothesis theory, aka the conventional academic theory. Okay, here's the theory. Smallpox has been around for 3,000 years, and it's always been the super deadly major pox variety. Any people who question how deadly smallpox was were probably conflating it with chickenpox or measles, or were otherwise blind and or full of shit. The smallpox that got spread to the Americas was normal European smallpox, and the indigenous population was either A, not dramatically more susceptible than the Europeans, or B, was dramatically more susceptible than the Europeans because of a hypothetical, unknown, and unstated genetic fluke that we don't know about. Minor pox happened relatively recently and started displacing major pox in the late 19th century because it was less lethal and therefore more likely to get spread. Then smallpox was eliminated as a disease and everyone cheered, so none of this shit matters anymore anyway, stop asking us for funding. Maybe I didn't do the best job presenting Theory 1, but there's just too much evidence against it, both historical and more recently scientific, for me to consider it all that credible. But you should always present the null hypothesis if you can. This is the baseline understanding that we are working off of, okay? So, Theory 2, a tale of two poxes. Here's the theory. Smallpox was around since the year 300 or so, but it was pretty much a benign disease for the standards of the time. That is, historically, all smallpox was actually minor pox. It had a low mortality rate and was considered a normal disease of children in most of the populations it affected. Where it emerged geographically is unclear, but it spread through the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and eventually Europe, and went generally unremarked until the 16th century, when some combination of freak accident, mutation, and bottleneck event created the far more virulent major pox strain. However this strain originated, it became established in Europe, displacing minor pox. It was subsequently spread from Europe by sailors and traders throughout the rest of the world, becoming what we modern people think of when we think of smallpox. Major pox and minor pox, therefore, existed together in the world for about 500 years, vying for dominance, but most of the medical attention was focused on the deadlier major pox, which left far more victims, and therefore the scale and presence of minor pox was consistently underreported. Then smallpox was eliminated as a disease, and everyone cheered, so none of this shit matters anymore anyway. Stop asking us for funding. This theory is my attempt to apply the law of Occam's razor and keep the explanation as simple as possible while fitting as much of the historical evidence as possible. I quite like it because it's straightforward and requires very few inferences and assumptions, but it doesn't take into account the historical experience of smallpox in Asia, which all signs indicate was severe enough for them to literally invent the concept of vaccination specifically against smallpox around, we think, 1000 AD? Also, if otopox turned out to really be smallpox, this would completely sink this theory. So, thanks, Japan. So we move on to Theory 3. Theory 3, the many strains, many bottlenecks theory. Okay, here's the theory. Smallpox emerged around the year 300 or so, but thanks to the difficulty of long-distance travel and the relative geographic isolation of populations, smallpox spread between populations was a rare event, spurring multiple genetic bottlenecks. It is unclear how deadly original human smallpox was for its original human hosts, but for everyone around, smallpox became a game of chance. A rare interaction could spread a particular substrain from one population to another, and this substrain could be more or less deadly just by virtue of mutation and chance. The historical evidence suggests that once a dominant strain gets established in a region, it tends to stay regionally dominant, but possibly also evolve to be less severe with time. So we see the Middle East and Europe getting lucky with the relatively harmless Razipox. China and India got reportedly less lucky with the somewhat more severe Oxypox. Japan got very unlucky with Otopox. As with Theory 2, and as backed by the scientific evidence, major pox emerged from an existing, likely non-lethal strain of smallpox around the year 1500 and dropped like a bombshell on the world. It got established in Europe and subsequently spread around the world in epidemics. Wherever it spread, it was generally competing with regionally established strains of smallpox, but the degree of that competition probably went historically and academically underappreciated because all of the attention was on the new, exceptionally lethal strain. Then, smallpox was eliminated as a disease and everyone cheered, so none of this shit matters anymore anyway. Stop asking us for funding. So, I think this theory is the most consistent with all of the available evidence, but I do in some respects recognize that this is a theory of convenience. It requires us to effectively invent a different strain of smallpox with different clinical features for every region that had a different experience with smallpox. However, given how infectious diseases work, given how bottlenecks can shape the evolution of a microorganism, and given the detailed historical accounts of smallpox in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe over time, I think this theory is the one that best lines up. This leaves us really with one glaring question, one big mystery, and that is how major pox emerged and how it managed to become the globally dominant version of smallpox in the span of a few hundred years. Again, proving anything would require actual work, but I'll lay out some speculations. I think that the Spanish-Aztec contact circa 1520 was the key moment for major pox getting established in the world at large. Let me explain. The Aztecs were a virgin, non-immune population with respects to smallpox. Whatever strain of smallpox that was spread to that population would become the dominant endemic strain, circulating within that population and then back out to anyone who interacted with them. That strain happened to be what we know today to be variola major, and so the Aztecs and other indigenous American populations through them effectively became an uncontested permanent reservoir of variola major, i.e. major pox. Infectious disease is ultimately a game of probabilities. Chance to get infected, chance to become ill, chance to spread the disease to someone else, chance that the pathogen evolves down this or that direction, chance for it to get established and keep spreading. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God does indeed play dice, and that the dice are sometimes loaded. The spread of major pox through the Americas lit a fire that would not be extinguished for over 400 years, and established a reliable, smoldering furnace from which this particular strain of smallpox could try to spread over and over until it eventually succeeded and began to outcompete the endemic and less deadly European strains of smallpox. I believe this event loaded the dice, if you will. The Spanish-Aztec contact could have been the origin point of major pox, though I will not pretend to claim that with any degree of confidence. This is hard speculation that isn't supported by any hard evidence, but also not strongly contradicted by any evidence as well, as far as I can tell. The reason I find this theory so enticing is that this event represents a bottleneck opportunity, a fluke encounter where one particular viral mutant jumped from its previous host to a susceptible individual with the perfect conditions to become established. The evidence suggests that major pox emerged 500 years ago, so the timeline lines up, and this bottleneck represents the biggest opportunity for it to emerge from a probability perspective. Well, alright, so alternatively, could have it emerged from Europe like basically everyone thinks? Sure, yes. Could it have emerged from Africa and spread through the slave trade? Also, yes. Just because the most definitive record I could find of something that was definitively smallpox and definitively lethal and definitively not the plague, measles, or typhus comes from 1570s Italy doesn't mean it wasn't around. It could also have conceivably come from somewhere in Asia, and the sea trade between Asia and Europe was picking up at the time. I don't think it came from Japan, since the divergence between major and minor pox happened too recently for it to be related to any smallpox strain that jumped over to Japan in 735, despite similarities in lethality. If anything, I think it may actually have been reintroduced to Japan by Europeans in the 1700s after being extinct for several centuries. This is also speculation, by the way. I lack non-paywalled and English language sources on this. But regardless of where major pox came from, the records are pretty clear that Europe ultimately ended up being its incubator and the center point from where it spread to everywhere else. At which point people started to say, hey, we should really do something about this disease that's killing everyone, and eventually they did. Next time, we'll talk about the history of smallpox immunization and eradication. And that time, the British gave a bunch of orphans smallpox as a science experiment. Seriously, that happened. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this historical retrospective on smallpox. And stay tuned for part 2. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God does indeed play dice, and that the dice are sometimes loaded. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God plays poker but cheats like a motherfucker. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God plays baccarat. What the hell is baccarat anyway? Card game primarily played in casinos. What the? Okay, never mind. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God plays dice, but picks them up right after rolling, so you can't see what he rolled, but then he claims he rolled a natural 20 and totally critically hit the dragon. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God does not play Dark Souls, because it's not a very good game. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God will play Monopoly with you if it makes you feel better, but he is silently judging you always. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God does not play Warhammer, but will spend hours watching lore videos on YouTube. If you're considering a career in epidemiology, you have to understand that God will play anything, but will use his powers of omnipotence to rewind time if he starts losing. In theological terms, this is known as save scumming.